As I read and prayed over today's readings, for some reason one of my favorite movies came to mind. I can't recommend it without reservation, which is the case for most movies that come out of Hollywood, but it's still a great movie. You might have seen it. It's called The Edge. Anthony Hopkins is the main actor. Came out in 1997. It's worth seeing if you haven't had a chance to see it. Basically, it's a combination of a Western, an action film, a drama, and a soap opera. So there's something for everyone in it. But you might ask, what was the main thing you got out of it? Well, one of the unique experiences I've never had before that I had thanks to that movie was that I ended up feeling sorry for a billionaire. So I don't know if that attracts you for a movie, but it's kind of a unique experience. But the central character is acted by Anthony Hopkins, the billionaire, and one of his false friends at one point says, "It must be tough having all that money, not knowing who your friends are, not knowing why people like you, whether it's you or just the money." And he was trying to push the guy's button because he was jealous of him. And he wasn't too far from hitting the mark, because as you watch the film, you can see the character Anthony Hopkins represents is a little bit unsure why people are so friendly to him. And he's got a big heart, he's generous, but he's a little bit paranoid about it. But he had a great comeback line. He didn't want to let this false friend see him sweat, so he said, "Never feel sorry for a man who owns a jet." You got to see the movie. Well, after today's gospel, I felt sorry for God. So if you think I'm odd for feeling sorry for a billionaire, try feeling sorry for God. But that's really the purpose, I think, or one of them, of our parables from the Old Testament and the gospel. It really kind of touches your heart if you pray over it and think about it. Here you see there's this generous landowner who leases his vineyard to these tenants, probably at a very generous rate, probably just wanting 10%, a tithe of the produce. So of course the landowner is God. The tenants are the Israelites, led by the Pharisees and Sadducees. And the tithe is a share of their income and their worship and praise. And of course, the landowner at vintage time sends his servants to collect the rent. Of course, the servants are all the prophets of the Old Testament over the centuries that went back, came to Israel to ask for greater worship and praise to receive the rent. And what did they historically do to the prophets? Maybe we do it to this day. They ignored them, they beat them, they killed them, they stoned them. And so what does God do? The landowner, he says, "I know what I'll do. I'll send my son. They'll listen to him." Of course, that's Jesus. And we know what happened to him. He was crucified. He was ignored too. And so Jesus really was prophesizing his own death in this parable. But I find it very moving. I mean, look at all that God gave Israel. Look at all that he gives us. This great vineyard, the rich land of the United States. And how much do we really give back to God? Do we give a true tithe, a 10% or more to God in his honor and glory, not just of our wealth, but our time and praise and our attention? It's hard not to feel sorry for such a generous God when he gives us so much. And if we're honest with ourselves, my response, your response, the response of our country is not adequate. When I look at this in the way God does everything he can to touch our hearts, tells us beautiful stories like this, he is the great communicator. Over and over, he'll speak to you and me in terms and experiences that we can understand. I've certainly experienced that in my life. He'll send me signs, and sometimes I don't want to hear what he's trying to tell me, but he'll keep at it, sign after sign, to touch my heart. He's really interested. He goes out of his way to save us and to win over our wayward hearts. And it shouldn't surprise us then that that's why he became man, to be amongst us. I think we sometimes think Jesus died on the cross to justify us, to die in our place, to save our soul, and that's true. But I also think he did it because he wanted to touch our hearts. He really wanted to win over our compassion for him so that we would give ourselves to him. After the incarnation, it's literally true to say God suffered, God wept, God died. When the second person of the Holy Trinity took on a human nature, he became human. And so this divine person could truly die, weep, feel everything we feel. He did that to win us over, to move our hearts. God is the great communicator. And when you stop to think about it, he's had a great success. Over 1/3 of the world calls itself Christian. 2 billion, just over 2 billion. That's not bad. And of those, just over half are Catholic. He knows how to touch our hearts. He knows how to communicate his love for us. But how about you and me? Do we communicate our love for one another as effectively? Are we great communicators? I bring this up because this Sunday is the 48th World Communication Sunday, and it's also the beginning of Respect Life Month, and call this Respect Life Sunday. You know, part of respecting life, of course, is defending life from the womb until the tomb at all stages of life. But one part of respecting life we don't often think about is the way we communicate with one another. It's the way we take time and trouble to truly hear our opponent, our adversary, even our enemy, and to speak kindly and in charity of our opponents, whether they're political, cultural, or familial. You know, as a priest, too often I learn or hear of parishioners speaking, communicating uncharitably of other Christians. We tend to pigeonhole our opponent. We like to make it all black and white and then spread rumors that are unverified to support our perspective. And then, of course, when it gets back to that person, well, the chance now of building a consensus or coming together just got cut in half. And sometimes it even leads to a low-grade propaganda war. And I'm not just talking about between Democrats and Republicans in D.C. or fights, ethnic fights in some distant country. I'm talking about right here in our own city of Green Bay or in our own families. And this really is unbecoming in a society that wants to call itself Christian. And you know, when you look at these battles and fights, I've rarely seen all the fault fall on one side. It takes two to tango. We're too busy when we're trying to communicate our perspective, looking at the speck in our neighbor's eye, and don't spend enough time trying to take the plank out of our own eye. When I look at the culture of politics, some letters to the editors, even how we as religious leaders at times communicate, we have a long ways to go if we want to be great communicators of love, as is our Lord, and win people over and build a culture of peace and consensus, something that will foreshadow the kingdom. And I really believe that this is what Pope Francis was trying to get at in one of his addresses, which marks this day. And I'd like to quote a part of it because I think there's some very profound ideas in this passage. He wrote, "We need to recover a certain sense of deliberateness and calm. This calls for time and the ability to be silent and to listen. We need also to be patient if we want to understand those who are different from us." And this line really is beautiful. People only express themselves fully when they are not merely tolerated, but know that they are truly accepted. If we're genuinely attentive in listening to others, we will learn to look at the world with different eyes. Now, the Pope isn't saying that if we reach out to our enemies or our opponents, those that really bother us, that we're going to change our opinion. We might be right, and in that case, it would be wrong to change our opinion. But I think what he's implying is that we might see the situation in a fuller context, be tooled to better communicate with the other, and combine what is true in their concerns with what is true in ours. And you know what? Even if nothing comes of it, if we walk away still with the same angst and division that was there before, it still shows a respect for the humanity of the other. I think there's a chivalry in it, a beauty in such behavior that moves hearts and wins the respect of those who are watching how we interact with our opponent, and sometimes even begrudgingly wins the respect of the one who resists us. But too often these days, we follow the rules of Machiavelli when it comes to anything affecting our wallet, our politics, or our pride. And that has to stop. We need to rediscover the code of the knights of old. His Holiness goes on to write, whenever communication is aimed primarily at manipulating others, we are dealing with a form of violent aggression. Nowadays, there is a danger that certain media so condition our responses that we fail to see our real neighbor. Think about it. Do we even trust our media anymore? Just asking. It really is a violation of the 8th commandment, bearing false witness against thy neighbor, when we or the media pass on unverified or embellished comments that we hear about our opponents. And you know, even if it's verified, it's detraction if we needlessly pass it on. I mean, what kind of culture do we create of communion and communication for our children who grow up in this world when we operate this way? When we look at God, it was because of his great humility, his willingness to come amongst us as a humble child that grew up to then be crucified, that he communicated love so effectively that he brought billions of people together and protected the dignity of life. Who knows how many wars have been prevented because of God's ability to communicate so beautifully. Let's take a good hard look at how you and I treat our neighbor in our speech, especially our so-called enemies, the ones we struggle with. Are we Machiavellians, or do we follow the path of the knights of old, the path of Christ himself?